any more ado, let's get going. So welcome to the first of two live presentations I'll be doing about the Tour du Mont Blanc, and thank you for joining us. My name is Marvin Faure, and I'm the founder and general manager, if you will, of Alpine Cols, which is a group of cycling coaches. Four of us are French, one is a New Zealand French, and myself, I'm Anglo-French. We all live pretty much in the Alps. We're all based in this area, and of course, we're all passionate about road cycling and especially sportives, grand fondos, and the TMB is clearly the big one. This first presentation is about guidelines for your personal training plan. It'll last 40 to 45 minutes. It's being recorded, and I'll make it available for replay afterwards on our YouTube channel. I'm delighted to answer any questions you may have at the end, and don't hesitate to send any questions to me by email as well. You've got my email already, so that should be easy to do. I'll reply to you just as soon as I can. All right, so let's get going. The first presentation tonight, as I say, is about your training. The second one on the 16th of June will be very much focused on how to get your best result on the day. Really focused tactics and pacing and nutrition and equipment and everything you need to get right to have a good ride on the day. Oh, for this evening, then I'm not going to go into any details on the route itself. That I will talk about much more on the 16th of June, of course. But just a very brief overview, just to remind ourselves what we're talking about here. It's often referred to as the toughest one-day sportive in the world. There are some that would dispute that, but it's certainly right up there amongst the very, very toughest. It's a loop through 3 countries, which is a challenge for the organizers, especially in this time of COVID. But it goes through France, Switzerland, and Italy, around Europe's highest mountain, of course. Without going into details, suffice to say that it covers 338 kilometers, 8,500 meters of climbing, and that is massive. Those are really, really big numbers. Hopefully you know that. But you must not take this event lightly. It's difficult to imagine what a step up this is from doing even quite a significant, a major sportive or grand fondo like the Marmot or the Maratona. This is a big step up from that. It's not just a little bit harder. It's twice, 3, 4 times as hard. The distance. There's a lot more fatigue involved when you double the distance and the climbing. One of our coaches, the guy I mentioned, who's a New Zealander, naturalized French now, he calls the event a Marmot on steroids. And he's an impressive rider. He's done a lot of really, really tough stuff, but this one for him was the toughest of them all. Just for the anecdote, he finished the event in 2013. He did it 2013 in absolutely atrocious conditions. It was raining pretty much all day, and it was practically snowing on the Saint Bernard. And he made a remarkable time of 13 hours and 46 minutes, in spite of being unsupported and having to repair 2 punctures. So, tough guys, these Kiwis. That I definitely would not have achieved anything like that. So with that said, let's look into a little bit more of the detail. Everybody starts in the dark. It starts at 5 o'clock in the morning, so the first descent is in the dark. And unlike the guy in the photo here, many will finish after nightfall, and many, in fact, still have to do the last major descent from the Cormier de Roseland in the dark, as well as the final climb, of course. So that's something to be aware of, and obviously prepare for in terms of equipment. You've got to have lights for that. But it means that now the cutoff time to be considered a finisher is midnight. So all finishers by definition, are going to take somewhere between 12 and 19 hours. If you do manage to finish, you can be seriously proud of yourself. You'll be among, it's a select few who found the mental and physical endurance to do this. It remains a very, very serious challenge. In a good year, the attrition rate is 40%. In a bad year, when the weather is bad, it's much higher than that. You don't want to ask how high it is. There's no classification. It's above all an endurance challenge, and although you'll get your timing, you're not going to be classified. So you can probably get an idea of where you are in the classification, but it's not intended to be in any way, shape, or form a race. Everybody gets the medal and a gold certificate. So it's an endurance ride. That's should be clear. It's really a challenge on 3 different levels: a mental level, a physical level, and nutritional. And it's in that order. You're being physically unfit or failing to eat or drink enough will sabotage your ride, that's for sure, just as much as will a mechanical failure. But the most likely reason to abandon, the reason most people abandon, is mental. It just becomes too much, and they put a foot down and stop. It's often on the hardest climb is quite often the one from, or the two from last, actually, the Petit Saint-Bernard or the Cormet de Roseland. You know, if you can get over the Cormet de Roseland, then all you've got left is the Saisy, and unless you're really running out of time, then of course anyone can do that. But it's often, people often break mentally rather than physically. You've got much more physical resources than you imagine, and it tends to be the head which gives up first. For most first timers, unless you've done something else which is broadly comparable, it'll be the toughest thing you've ever done, probably by some considerable margin. At the halfway point, you'll have ridden almost the equivalent of the Marmot or the Maratona, but it's still only halfway. And if you're anything like me, you tend to finish the Marmot in a state of fairly advanced exhaustion and swear you'll never do it again. So just think of that when you're thinking of the Tour du Mont Blanc. You have to take this thing seriously. So I think I've probably said enough of, well, maybe I'll just add, what always happens is you go through highs and lows. So you need to be ready for that, from euphoria to despair and back. It can happen a couple of times or more during the event. It's hard to understand why. It's unpredictable, but there are moments when you feel really, really good. And then a few minutes or half an hour later, you feel really, really bad. And you've just got to be able to keep going through those moments. I'll talk more about that on the 16th of June when I talk about doing the event itself. For the moment, it's just good to have that in mind, because the more you train, the more you do long rides in training, and the more you do long mountain rides in training, the more you're preparing yourself psychologically for this type of thing as well. Okay, so now before we can look at how to train for it, we need to analyze and just briefly, what does it take? What are the event demands? And I'd like to say an introduction to this, that you should prepare an event like this over several years. If you're new to cycling, it's not a good idea to sign up for the Tour du Mont Blanc in perhaps your second or third year of cycling, unless you're extraordinarily fit from previous sports. If you're new to cycling, you want to build experience with shorter events, and you want to, I would say the minimum sort of distance you should have done last year to be confident having a reasonable stab at the Tour du Mont Blanc this year, the minimum you should have done would be 5,000 kilometers and 50,000 meters of climbing. But that's really a minimum. The great majority of people who ride the Tour du Mont Blanc will have done twice or between twice and 4 times those numbers. Just to give my own numbers, and they're by no means exceptional. Last year I did about 16,000 kilometers and 250,000 meters. So that's definitely a solid base to do the Tour du Mont Blanc this coming year. But if you're at less than 5,000, I would question whether it's a wise thing to do. Now, so what does it take? Well, we can break it down into different subcategories. So the first, of course, is physical or physiological. The most important of those is to have an exceptional aerobic endurance. You've got to be able to keep going for up to 19 hours. So that's all aerobic, that's endurance, that's just the ability to keep riding, keep turning the pedals, keep going hour after hour after hour. There's only one way you build that sort of endurance, that's by riding. There's going to have to be many, many hours spent on the bike between now and July in order to build it. The second physiological characteristic or demand the event places on you is the highest possible power to weight ratio. You know, obviously, the more power you can put out, the better for climbing, and the lower your body weight or the weight of you and your bike combined, the better. I'm not suggesting we try to emulate the pros and reach 65 kilos and be have 8% fat. But the more you can go in that direction, the better. Just be sensible about it. You know, if you've got a heavy frame, you've got a heavy frame, and that's the way it is. And then finally, physiological, you want to be able to make a long sustained effort and then recover quickly. Make another long sustained effort and recover quickly, because you're climbing, descending, climbing, descending. The ability to recover quickly on those descents and be ready to make another climb is really helpful. So how do you train that? Well, it's by practicing it. It's by making series of climbs and descents. We come back again to the training. Now, the next key event demand is psychological. I mentioned that the reason why most people give up is largely mental. So clearly the psychological demands on you are very strong, very high. You've got to be able to stay positive throughout the day. You've got to be able to maintain your focus and stay lucid, be able to stand back and look at what's going on, understand what's going on in your body and in your own head, and stay in control. You've got to be able to stick to the plan. If the plan says, I will ride at such and such a pace, don't let yourself get sucked into riding faster, for example. And so all of those are psychological skills that need to be developed. Finally, technical, it's a highly mountainous event. When you're climbing so much, you obviously got to descend so much as well. So you need both excellent climbing skills, by which I mean the right way to pedal, the most economical way to transfer your energy onto the pedals. That's a skill which you can learn, practice, and develop. And then, of course, excellent descending and cornering skills, because otherwise you're going to waste. You're either going to be dangerous for yourself or others, or you're going to have to go descend slowly and waste an awful lot of time unnecessarily on the descent. The great thing about descending is it's a pure skill. There's no effort involved. If you can learn the skill, you will go much faster. It's nothing like the effort of climbing up the mountain in the first place. Other technical skills you need to develop are the ability to refuel throughout the day while you're riding to supply your energy needs. You're going to need somewhere between 8 and 10, possibly even 12,000 calories during the day. Depends on how heavy you are and how much power you need, how much power you actually have to use to get up the hills. That's a huge amount of calories, and there's no way you're going to get round without replacing a good part of them throughout the day. So I'm not going to talk about how to do that this evening. I'll come back on that in detail on the 12th of June. But it's a skill you will inevitably have to develop anyway during your training runs. And the other thing you need to be able to do is to adapt to temperatures while you're riding, because it's usually extremely hot in the Italian valley when we get down to Aosta, and it can be extremely cold on the mountaintops. So there can be a difference of 25 degrees, sometimes even more. So you've got to be able to adapt for that. You've got to have the right equipment and be able to manage that while you're riding. If you have to stop and spend lots of time doing that, then obviously it's not good. So that's a summary of the event demands. Now there's no standard training plan for this event. That really doesn't exist. It's important to understand that. A training plan is always designed for a specific event, but it's also designed with a specific rider profile in mind. because what works for one rider won't work for another. So what's unique to you is exactly your own goals, your own strengths, your limiters, your experience, your context, blah, blah, you know, all of those things are unique to you. And so you need a training plan that takes all of that into account. So I can't give you a training plan, but what I can give you is a framework and guidelines which enable you to design your own training plan, bearing those guidelines and so on in mind. So we've looked at what the event requires of you. So you've got that now. Now we're going to start looking at the guidelines. So first of all, the general principles. The whole point of this plan is to build the strongest possible aerobic engine, if you will, the strongest possible aerobic base. And to do this, we recommend training predominantly at low intensity. That means in zones 1 or zone 2. That's, for most people, that's around 70 to 75% of your FTP, or 70 to 75% of your maximum heart rate. Curiously, the percentages are the same, more by coincidence than anything else, I think. But that's a fact. So that is quite slow. Most people, obviously I don't know for the people on this call, but most people would train at a higher intensity than that most of the time. Most of us go out, and when we do a climb, we're going to do it at tempo at least, if not actually at threshold. Well, when you're preparing for the Tour du Mont Blanc, you've got to back off and recognize that for this period of time, the goal is the aerobic base. It's not climbing fast, it's climbing for a very, very long time. It's climbing basically all day. And that requires a different approach. It means climbing slowly in a very economic and energy efficient way. Okay, so that's low intensity. You want to do, of course, as much climbing as possible. And again, at low intensity, but as much climbing as possible. Now, I recognize this is complicated if you live far away from the mountains, if you're in a flat country like the Netherlands or the south of England or wherever you may be. There are several ways around it. None of them are ideal, but they all help to some extent. So the first thing you can do, this is a good thing to do in the Netherlands, of course, there may be no mountains, but there's plenty of wind. So one thing you can do is sit up straight on the bike. You don't bend over in an aero position, you sit up straight, so you're taking as much wind as possible. Use a high gear and therefore low cadence, and pedal into the wind as if you were climbing a mountain. It's not perfect, but it's about as close as you can get in flat country. The other thing you can do, obviously, is go and look for the nearest hills. If again, I talk about the Netherlands because it's so well known for being flat. Of course, you can go down to Limburg and use the hills around the area of the Amstel Gold Race. In the south of England, there are hills. Elsewhere, there are hills, so it just may take a little bit more time to go and find them. And you just have to repeat short hills as opposed to doing fewer long hills. That's that. And then the third way to simulate climbing, of course, is on a turbo trainer, particularly a smart trainer. And in fact, you can ride all of the climbs on the Tour du Mont Blanc in virtual reality. With there are several of the virtual reality systems that have high definition videos of these climbs, and they're linked to your smart trainer, so you can. If you jack the front wheel up to 7 or 8 to simulate the 7 or 8%, then you can. It's as close as you can possibly get without being out on the road itself. So that's how you can get around not being able to do climb for real, as it were, in a flat country. I would still recommend, of course, if at all possible, planning a training camp in the mountains, perhaps in May or June. So that you do get that mountain experience before you come to the Tour du Mont Blanc. The third principle is to increase the load progressively. I'll give some I think I already put some numbers on the load. We're aiming to try to get, if possible, to something like 20 hours a week. But there's no way you can, leaving aside any constraints you might have, even if you're retired and have no constraints at all, there's no way you can go from, let's say, 4 or 5 hours a week to 20 hours a week in one go and maintain that. you can do it as a one-off for a training camp, but there's no way you can maintain that. So to reach that level of average load per week, you've got to build it progressively. So you may be at something like 4 or 5 hours at the moment. You want to per week. You want to build that to 6 or 8 first, and then just get there progressively. The fourth principle is rest and recover after hard training. As you probably know, or certainly should know, training breaks you down, recovery builds you back up. Training does damage, and recovery allows that damage to be repaired and hopefully to build back stronger. So the two are absolutely essential. It's two sides of a coin. And if you always stay on the one side of the coin, if you train, sooner or later, you'll fall off a cliff into overtraining, and then it takes a very, very long time to come back again. So it's very important to recover. I cannot emphasize that too strongly. It's better to err on too much recovery than too little. Finally, the fifth principle is, I mentioned this already, is the importance of developing your technical skills, but it's probably not going to happen by itself, or it'll be a miracle if it does. Make an effort to focus on the technical skills. Pedaling, of course, when you're climbing, your pedaling and climbing technique. I can't go into the details now, but there's plenty of information around that. Or find yourself a coach who can work with you on that. And equally, of course, skills for descending. Very, very important. So what does this now, I'm looking now at the framework. You can find this on the TMB website. If you haven't found it already, it's there on the practical infos with our name on it. Or you can send a request to me. They should, I think they've got the updated version on there now. I forgot to check today, I must admit. But there is a version for 2022. The one we're looking at there is from last year, but it doesn't matter because the dates have changed, but the structure hasn't. So what do we have here? We've got a series of what we call macro cycles. So these big cycles: preparation, pre-competition, and competition. So let me just pull that up. The first phase, so the first big period, is the next 3 months, basically from now until mid-April, which we call the preparation phase. And that's really about building towards the 10 to 15 hours a week on average that you should be doing by the end of that period. The next period is called pre-competition. So that's when you're really training hard. You're really pushing the body as far as you can go, and you're going to build towards 15 to 20 hours a week. More if possible, and less if you can't do more or can't do as much. And then finally, just the last 2 or 3 weeks are the taper or the competition phase, where we reduce the load right down in order to reduce the fatigue and but still maintain your fitness. Now, the other thing to notice on this chart is this blue jagged line, sort of sawtooth line on the right. That's just a schema or a schematic of the load. It's in arbitrary units there. You can see at the top there are 5 units, 1 to 5. 5 means maximum, 1 means minimum. So totally arbitrary, but that could be TSS units, it could be hours, it could be kilometers. However you can most easily measure your training load. And you can see that varies in these so-called mesocycles, the shorter, the 4-week periods here. It increases for 3 weeks, then drops for a week of recovery, increases for 3 weeks, drops for another week of recovery, and so on. So it's in that continuous cycling of 3 weeks increasing, 1 week reducing. Now, that's a very typical periodization approach. It's by no means the only way to do it, and it's a little bit rigid. A lot of people find it a little bit rigid. Inevitably, there are constraints which get in the way, which mean that the load week is a week when you have to go on a work trip, or else or the recovery week is a week when you've got nothing going on. So you have to play around with it and make it fit. So it quickly becomes less than ideal. The other thing to be aware of is that if you're over 50, then it's worth, most coaches would advise you, and I would certainly advise you, to consider moving to a 3-week cycle instead of 4 weeks, because as we get 50 and older, we recover less and less well. It takes us longer and longer to recover. So it's better to have just a 2-week load cycle and then a 1-week recovery. Again, the weeks, it's arbitrary to break it into weeks. It's obviously more for the convenience of the work week than anything else. Our natural body rhythms may be a little bit different, so don't hesitate to do what works for you. There are many people who don't periodize like this and just take a break when they feel that they need to take a break. But you need to be very self-aware if you're going to do it that way. You should never go longer than a 3-week period without taking a substantial amount of recovery. The second page of the plan framework is this one here, where I've set out some typical training weeks. The left-hand side of that chart is exactly the same, by the way. It's just the right-hand side which changes. I've set out some typical training weeks with what's high priority in general. These are obviously general guidelines, so you need to think about them for your own specific case, for the high volume weeks, recovery weeks, and so on and so forth. So look at those. I'm not going to comment that in any detail now, but we will look at some of the content in some of the later slides, which I'll get onto in just a second. So turning that into a training plan which makes sense for you. The first way to do it, let's be pragmatic about it. The first thing to do is to start with your constraints, and especially your training time availability. What I suggest is be realistic right from the start, and confirm it with your partner, your other half, your family, and anybody else that might need to be a part of this, because that can save an awful lot of misunderstanding and arguments and frustrations later on. So which days of the week can you train in for how long? Which days in the coming months can you definitely not train? Are there any family holidays planned? Are there any work trips? Are there any, identify all of those constraints, put them on a calendar, and then look at, realistically speaking, how many hours do you have to train, available to train for each week. And then your training plan will start to fall into place once you've got that. Now, of course, inevitably it will evolve. At this stage, you certainly don't know all the constraints you're going to have in May and June. But put down what you've got, and then you obviously update it as you go along. You'll end up with something which is pretty far from ideal if you're normal, unless you're retired and have absolutely no constraints at all. But that can't be helped. You just got to live with, that's just life. Now, finally, before we get really into the detail, the other two things you need to think about when you're developing your plan are to customize the focus for you. First of all, is the Tour du Mont Blanc your only 2022 objective, or do you have another important objective that you put at more or less the same level? If that's the case, then your training plan becomes significantly more complicated, and it's way beyond the scope of what I'm going to talk about this evening. So this evening, I'm just focusing on as if the Tour du Mont Blanc is your only objective, but obviously you would have to make adjustments if that's not the case. And then secondly, you know yourself, you know what your strengths and limiters are versus the event demands we looked at. You know if you've got a high level of aerobic endurance or not, you know if you're a strong descender or not, and so on and so on. So your plan needs to take into account particularly any relative weaknesses you may have that are very important for this event. If you do have any, then you've obviously got to focus particularly on developing those before July. So at last, we can get now into the details of the preparation phase and what you should actually do. First of all, what are we trying to achieve in this phase? Well, we're trying to build training capacity and aerobic endurance, of course. We want to build up to 10-12 hours a week. We want to build strength endurance, which is the ability to push hard on the pedals when you're climbing on a steep climb. There are some steep climbs on the Tour du Mont Blanc. The climb to Champex in particular is very steep. We're looking at roughly 10 kilometers at almost 10%. So that's a, unless you've got mountain bike gears, you're going to be inevitably pushing very hard on the pedals, and that takes a lot of strength. It takes strength, and and you need strength endurance to be able to maintain that. If we're unlucky and the course includes, once again, which it wasn't planned last year, but 2 years ago, it had to go over the San Carlo. That's another brutal climb with a lot of very, very steep sections. And you've got to build a lot of strength endurance to get over that. Otherwise, it'll just be a complete nightmare. So this is something to work on. And then, of course, technical skills. So what do we actually do? Well, quite simply, these long rides, they're not complicated. They're just long. They're not complicated because they have to be done easy. There's nothing fancy about them. They have to feel slow. You should be able to talk to someone while you're riding without getting out of breath. Aerobic endurance, again, I can't emphasize too much how this is by far and away the most important quality you need to build. And so 90% of your training should be spent on these long, slow rides. And it's actually much more useful to do. You might ask me, well, okay, so a 6-hour ride, why don't I do 3 2-hour rides? It's more convenient for me, fits better with my family, with my commitments and so on. Yeah, I understand that, but it won't give you anything like the same benefit as a 6-hour. 3 times 2 hours is not equivalent to 1 times 6 hours. Why? Because after 2 hours, your body's starting to tire already, and your muscles are starting to tire in particular, and you're starting to recruit different muscle fibers. Up to 2 hours, it's basically all type 1 endurance fibers. After 2 hours, they start to get a little bit tired, and your muscles starting to get more and more of the type 2s involved. And by the time you get to 6 hours, you're well into using a lot of type 2 muscle fibers. Well, that'll never happen if you do 3 by 2 hour rides. But so of course, if you come to the Tour du Mont Blanc, you won't be ready for it. So it's better to do one long ride than several short ones. You want to do also, I would suggest 1 interval session per week, and this is focused on strength endurance. So the type of thing to do here is perhaps 4 to 8 minute efforts at this time of year. Initially in zone 3, then you can progress progressively to zone 4. But this is big gear work with low cadence, so high force, low cadence, high force on the pedals. Again, the goal is strength endurance, so you need to be using your strength to turn the pedals, as opposed to your cardiovascular system, which you're relying upon much more at a higher cadence. And of course, exercises for technical skills. If you're not a confident descender, then you need to spend some time on that. You might want to consider joining a training camp or find a coach who can help you out. Now, you may not be used to off-the-bike training. We're cyclists. A lot of cyclists don't like this sort of thing and are rather reluctant to get involved. I was myself for many years, but it was a mistake. Honestly, this is absolutely essential. Well, absolutely essential. It's very, very important. The more you can do, the more proper off-the-bike strength and conditioning work you can do, the stronger a cyclist you'll become. Why? Well, quite simply because you cannot develop leg strength to any significant extent on the bike. You just can't push hard enough on the pedals. If nothing else, you can't push for long enough on the pedals because even at 60 RPM, that's 1 complete revolution in 1 second. You've got maximum of half a second pushing on it. That's not going to make any significant difference to your strength. In a proper strength and conditioning program, you're holding the loads in squats and lunges and so on for much, much longer periods. And that's what builds the strength. So I strongly recommend you find a gym or a professional strength and conditioning coach, ideally with experience in cycling, who can work with you on this. It's important to work with a specialist because it is technical, and if you don't learn the right movement patterns, if you just look at videos on the internet and try and copy them without someone observing you and making sure you're doing them right, you are very likely to injure yourself. So just be very careful of that. I strongly recommend you do it, but also I strongly recommend you do it with some professional help if you're new to this. Obviously, if you've learned how to do it already, that's great. Just keep going. But there is a definite risk of injury. You want to be progressive. If you've never done it before, be progressive. It's really a multi-year thing. The older you get, the more important this is, because the older we get, the more our muscles start to atrophy and disappear and thin out, and we lose muscle mass. It's one of the principal effects of aging, but we can slow that down or even stop it for many years. You're through your 50s, 60s, and even into your 70s, you can maintain the majority of your lean muscle mass, but only by doing some serious strength work. Okay, combined with that, of course, it's vital to do mobility and flexibility. I would imagine most of you are already doing some of this. Here I recommend 2 to 3 15 to 20 minute sessions a week. Pilates or yoga are great practices. Again, you must follow correct technique, because again, there's a good risk of injuring yourself if you do it badly. I quite badly injured myself by stretching incorrectly once, and I was off the bike for several months because of that. So I'm speaking from experience here. So either a Pilates instructor, a yoga instructor, or a good physiotherapist will be able to give you some good instruction on this if you need it. Now, to continue with off the bike, if you're going to do so much cycling, I know there's not much time for anything else, but the more cycling you do, paradoxically, the more important it is to do something else as well, because cycling is an incomplete sport in the sense that it uses your muscles in a very particular and rather incomplete way, and it creates imbalances, and we can partly address those through yoga, Pilates, and some strength and conditioning, but it's also great to help address them through some off-the-bike activities. Other sports, like particularly swimming, is great, or in winter, of course, if you live anywhere near the mountains or near snow, then cross-country skiing. Running, if you are already a runner, I certainly wouldn't recommend starting running now if you're not already a runner, because you'll probably injure yourself. But walking, of course, is good, particularly if you've got a dog. It's a good excuse to get the dog out and go for a walk. Okay, so I spent a little bit of time on that, but I think it's important. Now, the next phase is the pre-competition phase, and our objectives here, of course, are to continue developing our endurance and our training capacity, our ability to train, to put more hours onto the bike. We want to be increasing the load up to an average of 15 or even 20 hours a week, again, if you can. And at the same time, it's essential to recover from these high loads to ensure that you're getting the adaptations that you need. And this is now the time when you should start to test the equipment and the type of nutrition and hydration and so on that you will be using on the day. Do not, whatever you do not show up on the day with some new equipment that you've never tested, or a new bib short, or a new jacket, or whatever it may be, or new types of food. Test everything before. You just never know how it's going to agree with you or work for you when you're out on a really long day on the bike, like you will be in July. So everything must be tested, and do that in training, obviously. Okay, so what do we do on the bike in this period? You're going to progress to, I said 15 to 20 hours a week. Well, what that means in terms of individual rides is probably something like a 9 to 10 hour ride in zone 2, if you can push it out that far. Bearing in mind, of course, that on the day itself, you might be riding for as long as 19 hours. Now, I don't suggest in training you go anywhere near as much as that. You can stop at it's perfect. You don't have to run a marathon in training in order to be able to run a marathon the day of the event. It's the same with the Tour du Mont Blanc, but you should probably aim at something like 60% of the kind of distance and time that you expect to take. So there's no point in trying to do over 300 kilometers, but it probably is a good idea to do at least 1 or 2 rides at 200 kilometers with a fair amount of climbing. So the question is how to do these rides. It's not easy to do them with other people. Most of us end up doing them alone because simply it's hard to, unless you know someone else who's preparing the Tour du Mont Blanc. But even then it's complicated because they're likely to have a different level than you, so they'll either be faster or slower. So someone's going to have to make compromises, which is not necessarily for the best. But if you've got someone at the same, roughly the same level who's preparing, great, fantastic, ride together. I recommend staying away from the typical Sunday club ride simply because it'll be too short, and B, it'll be much too fast. So it's not going to help you get ready for the Tour du Mont Blanc. Recovery rides in perhaps midweek. Keep them very short and keep them very, very easy. So zone 1, barely turning the pedals, your heart rate's barely moving above resting. Okay, it's just to turn the muscles over, turn the blood over, and help detoxify a bit. Make it really, really easy. The easy weeks have to be really, really easy so that the hard weeks can be really, really hard. I talked about the testing equipment and nutrition already, so of course you do that during your long rides, and that way you know what works and what doesn't work. Other things you might want to do are to practice changing your clothing and adapting to different temperatures while you're riding. Get used to carrying a couple of spare inner tubes and canisters and so on, because it certainly does happen to have 2 punctures on a ride. So get used to it. No need to spend a lot of time on this now, but still important to keep the off-the-bike training going. Now this is about maintaining strength rather than developing it, so you can cut it down in time and in intensity. If you stick to 2 sessions a week, then you can cut them down to half an hour instead of an hour, for example. Mobility and flexibility, Pilates, yoga, whatever it may be, I recommend maintaining that, however. Keep 2 or 3 sessions a week of 15 to 20 minutes, because it really is important to keep your body flexible and mobile. And keep doing whatever you do as a complementary activity. If you can manage to swim once a week, that's great, or go for a walk or whatever it may be. Now, the other things to really bear in mind, really important in this period when your training load is very high, are that you've got to support that training load by a really good quality of life. So the first thing to focus on is sleep. Make sure you maximize your sleep, get as much as you can. It's essential for recovery and adaptation, and being ready to live the rest of your life, let alone to do your training. So aim at a minimum of 8 hours per night, and try to wake up naturally without an alarm clock, to the extent possible, obviously. I strongly recommend you banish all screens from the bedroom. If you've got the habit of taking your mobile phone in there and just checking social media before you go to bed, I'd suggest dropping that for this period, because it's been shown to disturb sleep. The other thing, of course, is high quality nutrition. You've got to feed yourself well. You're going to be expending a huge amount of energy, so you need to replace that. It's even more important than usual. I'm not going to give any extensive advice on nutrition at this point. Obviously, it's not the time or place, and we don't have time for it. But the key principles are the obvious ones: avoid industrial food, avoid supplements. Don't fall for the latest supplement fad that you read in a magazine. Accept unless your doctor advises you to take it, of course, and eat the widest possible variety of fresh, top quality natural foods. And you'll be fine. The final thing, a bit of advice about sort of managing your whole life around this high level of training, is to try as much as possible to minimize unnecessary stress. Clearly, there's stress you can't do anything about. There's work stress, there's family stress, you may have to travel. But the more you can manage that, and the more you can either avoid it or find psychological strategies to cope with it and avoid getting upset by it, then the better off you will be. Stress has a very bad effect on the body when you're under a lot of high training stress already, and it will affect your body's ability to grow stronger. It's important. Now we're reaching the end. We're now maximum 3 weeks away from the event. We come to the competition phase, or the taper. Our objectives here are very simple. It's to eliminate the fatigue that we've built up in the last 3 months, and to maintaining our fitness. So that's it's a bit of a contradiction in terms. So we have to be careful how we do that. The goal, of course, is to arrive as fit as possible, but not tired. Now, the longer the event, the longer the taper, is a general principle. So if you're used to tapering for events and you would normally taper for a week, I would suggest tapering 2 weeks for the Tour du Mont Blanc. If you have no experience with tapering, I would still suggest 2 weeks. If you know yourself and you know you only need 2 or 3 days for a normal event, maybe you can get away with a week or 10 days for the Tour du Mont Blanc. You'll have to think about that. So what do you actually do? Well, you progressively reduce the training volume to get it down by at least 50%. So, for example, if you did a training camp, we have a training camp in the Alps on the first week of June, the 4th to 11th of June. So, I'm sure some people will be coming to that. If you did a training camp at that time, you should then take a short break, continue training for 15-20 hours a week until the beginning of the end of June, beginning of July. And from then on, you really start to taper it down. Just a couple of recovery rides on the midweek, and then 10 to 12 hours at the first weekend, and bring that down to 6 to 8 hours the final weekend, and then just another recovery ride during the week. Ideally, you want to arrive in Les Saisies 2 to 3 days in advance before the start. The earlier the better, to get all the stress and trouble of hassle of the travel out of the way. And then just do a couple of short rides to spin the legs, but nothing strenuous. I certainly wouldn't recommend going off and climbing the Commet de Roseland or anything like that. So, and the final point in that, during that taper phase, limit the intensity, but it's not totally zero. I wouldn't do everything as a recovery ride, because you'll start losing strength endurance if you do that. So do a little bit, put a little bit of pressure on some of the climbs, but keep them short. Oh, finally, in this taper phase, I put a beach there just to symbolize the fact there should be maximum relaxation, the need for sleep, to sleep well, to eat well, to stay supple, and to minimize the stress is obviously even more important now than it was earlier. So everything you can do to maximize those things is for the better. I realize that life gets in the way and it's not always possible, but at least if you know what you should be doing, you can do your best to do it. So that's it. We've reached the end. I've given you the principles and guidelines that should allow you to prepare yourself well. Now it's up to you. You can take those principles, create your own training plan, and then follow it, of course. If you'd like any professional help so that you're absolutely your best on D-Day, we're certainly able and willing to help. There are 2 different ways we can help. One is through training camps. We actually have a camp starting in Tenerife on the 29th of January, so in 10 days' time. Otherwise, we've got a camp at the end of May around Mont Ventoux and the Luberon, which will be fantastic. And then there's a second camp a couple of weeks later, beginning of June, in La Clusaz, So it's actually quite close to Les Saisies. And there's a sportive at the end of that week on the 12th of June called the Megève Mont Blanc that it will be possible to ride as part of our training camp. So if you're interested in either of those camps, let me know. I'd be delighted to hear from you. And the other way we can help you, of course, is through one-on-one coaching with a fully individualized, personalized plan, which takes into account exactly who you are, what your experience is, what your constraints are, and the rest of it. So we work with you to fully customize the plan and then follow it with you on a day-by-day basis and update it as necessary and as a function of how you respond and how things are going. I'm always ready to answer questions by email or by phone, so don't hesitate to contact me if you've got some simple questions or even complicated questions. I'll do my best to answer them. And that's it. So thank you very much for listening to the end. It's been a pleasure to present to you. And if you've got any questions, I'm very willing to answer them right now. So over to you.